And I'm actually here joined by my college best friend, Kathy Yang, who's sitting in the back. She and I served on a leadership team together in AAIB, which we back then called ACF, AACF. So I was the chapter president, she was the large group coordinator, and we lived at a building called the Blue Whale, which is the apartment building across from First Pres, for those of you who are down there. And still painted blue, I think, and that's why it was called the Blue Whale. I think we were on the 4th floor, 3rd or 4th floor, so we had a view of the Chicago skyline. Yeah, that was like the best view I would ever have as an adult. And so it's wonderful to be back, knowing that the ministry that existed here in 1988, that welcomed me as a freshman, still is meeting and sharing the good news with students on campus. It may be outside of your imagination to think about something like that. It certainly was for me, but it is strange to be back, to see all of your faces, and to know that there are parents here for family weekend as well, that this isn't something I would have imagined that many years ago, and to know that there is a legacy that was left behind from all of those really crazy long meetings, right, Kathy? Where we were deciding on, like, does the vision statement have to have a comma here or not? So thank you. So anyway, I was asked to talk about Asian American social justice and the context in which, as Christians, we should or should not engage. And I am a little curious as to what you all shared in your little icebreaker. Hopefully some of you are actually answering the question. What comes to mind when you hear social justice? So try to pretend you're in class, and you have to raise your hand and raise your voice and speak up. What did you think of, or what comes to mind when you think of social justice? Don't look down, because I'm not calling you.
Doing the right thing.
What?
Doing the right thing.
Doing the right thing. What else?
Addressing inequalities.
Addressing inequalities, good. What else?
Social justice exists because social injustice exists.
Ooh, that's good. Nice. Did everyone get that? Social justice exists because social injustice exists. Yes. Nice. What else? Should Christians be involved in social justice? Yes. Did you hear that in church? No. Why not? Costs too much money? Why does social justice cost too much money?
Well, what if the entire church in start talking about the campaign? Then it's time to go to agencies.
Right, right. How much does it cost all of you in 1 year to be here? Close to 70,000. Yeah. Think about that. And it'd be interesting to know how much like your church budgets are, or maintenance if you have your own building, or salary, how much it costs to run the vans. But that's a reality, is that the perception is social justice costs a lot of money. So I will say that as a student, social justice wasn't necessarily something that I cared all that deeply about, nor did we have language for it in the same way in churches and the evangelical space. And I would say that particularly in the last 10 years, I've become much more vocal in my talks, in my social media presence, in the way I engage with the issues around me, so much so that I've had friends, much like Kathy and others, that I went to school with asking me, like, hey, do you still love Jesus? Like, what is driving you? And what is behind the energy that they see and how I am addressing what's going on in the world. So I'm going to read you a little bit from my book, which I have copies of for sale. out of the conversation for self-preservation. We are taught to avoid conflict, to keep peace, and keep our personal opinions to ourselves because we are told that speaking out doesn't actually affect change. However, self-preservation takes on a different sense of urgency and meaning as the national and global political landscape continues to shift. The North American Church is again engaging in conversations around race and justice, but because of its past failures and current blind spots, the conversation often resorts to simplified binaries, such as white and black, men and women, privileged and lack of privilege, citizen and undocumented, and the refusal to dig deeper into racist and unjust systems can widen the chasm. I believe that Christians desire and can handle more complexity. Race and reconciliation can no longer be framed solely as a justice issue, but rather as core to the gospel. Theologically grounded in the imago Dei, the image of God. As Christians, if we truly believe we are all created in God's image, and that God, the Creator, had a hand in developing, creating, and shaping not just our embodied souls, but also the places and spaces we steward and have dominion over, then reconciliation with one another is not merely an option. It's part of God's mandate. It requires us to speak up and to speak out. In order to do so, we need to address personal development, which happens within the context of community. In some communities, certain voices are erased and suppressed, while others are amplified and elevated. The concept of voice isn't only what is said or written, but also includes how identity is expressed in word and deed. Voice is not limited to what comes out of my mouth, but out of my being. The Latin word vox, meaning voice, and related word vocare, means to call, gives us the root voc or voc. Words from the Latin have something to do with the voice or with calling. Anything vocal is produced by the voice. Come on, Northwesterners here. A vocation is the work that someone is called to do as a job. To evoke is to call forth. To invoke is to call on for aid or protection. To provoke is to call forth another's anger. The challenge to raise your voice is about doing the good work of the good news. It's about calling forth others, an invocation for all and a provocation for some. Our lives should affect the world around us if we are bearers of God's image, as well as an embodiment of the good news. Again, our lives should affect the world around us. Living as a Korean American Christian woman, there is something critical about speaking from a place of wholeness and uniqueness that makes my voice part of a community, but also uniquely mine. It fills in the blanks left in others' stories. And when more of us from different intersections and margins raise our voices, we live out a fuller picture of the good news. And so I want to challenge all of you to consider why you are here at an Asian American Fellowship. So I didn't call myself Asian American until I got to college. Before that, I called myself Korean American. There was no other identification. And then I came to college and realized there were a lot of people who looked sort of like me, but came from other places in Asia. And so I adopted that term, Asian America, which is a geopolitical term. It kind of gives us an identity that pulls in people who can speak almost 30 different languages and come from that many more countries, all in a certain space called Asia, right? So I want you to wrestle with and be able to articulate at some point in your 4 years why you are at an Asian American Christian Fellowship. Do any of you know why you chose this group over the many others that exist on campus? Can anyone here articulate? I'm being serious, actually. How many of you know why you've chosen an Asian American Fellowship? I love that someone's trying to volunteer someone else, which is also so culturally appropriate. I would love to hear someone else who hasn't had a chance to speak, even if you want to volunteer someone next to you. Yes?
I decided to join Asian American University because being Asian American is a good thing. Want me to say it louder?
Yes.
I'm in Asian American University because being Asian American is a big part of my identity. I'm also in a sorority, and so when I was considering the different possibilities in diversity, people ask me why aren't you in? We had a fraternity and sorority university, and it's because being Asian American is more core to my identity.
So Asian American is more a core identity than Greek. Yes. So I want to encourage all of you to think deeply about why you are here, why you have chosen to be a part of an Asian American fellowship. And what I also want you to hear is that you are not isolating yourself in a safe bubble and hiding from the rest of the campus. I want you to hear that this space is a valid space that God has created and sustained on this campus for more than 30 years because He loves not just Northwestern students, but He loves Asian American students who want to wrestle with what their ethnic identity means in the context of their faith. I want you to hear that it is important for you to wrestle with the fact that God did not accidentally create you as Asian American, but sees that as very good. And that your culture, whether you identify as Asian American or Korean American or Vietnamese American, that there is something in the unique aspects of not only your culture, but your people's story that points to the good news of Jesus. That it is not a whitewashed, generic story of Christianity, but that it is unique to your people. And that justice is very much tied to the story of how so many of us are here, as is injustice. I am Korean American. My parents grew up in South Korea. My husband's parents grew up in North Korea. Those divisions were made by the Americans, the United States. We are still technically at war, right? And there are some people who are like, yes, burn it all down. But I challenge you to take advantage of the Asian American Studies program here at University, or at Northwestern that did not exist when Kathy and I were students here. That was a result of Asian American students, some who were a part of the university and other Christian organizations on campus, who wanted to say that our stories were missing in the institution of higher education. And part of that is that it is also missing in our faith and in the story of the church. I want us to dive a little bit into the story of Esther, in part because I think that Asian Americans can wrestle with and understand the story of Esther, because Esther had another name. What was her other name? Really? Hadassah was her other name. That was her Jewish name. So I don't know about you, how you learned the story of Esther, but I learned it through a white male lens. I learned it as a story of a young, beautiful woman who won a beauty pageant and became queen. And my understanding of queen and royalty is very much tied to the problematic institution of British royalty. Sparkle Markle and all of that, it was wonderful. wedding. But Esther is a story of racial passing. Racial passing. So she is not Persian, she is Jewish. And for all intents and purposes, she is different than, say, Daniel, who maintained Jewish practices. He maintained the dietary rules. Esther did not. She passed. And there is a way in which we, as Asian Americans, and I think as Christian Asian Americans, we pass. We embrace the myth of the model minority. We have pursued the American dream. We do this because our parents have sacrificed so much that on our backs we carry the weight of succeeding, right? And doing well, and getting into a highly selective school, and eventually going into your grad program, or into med school, or into some sort of successful career route. We embrace, in some ways, that model minority, and I think that's why sometimes we're uncomfortable with gathering in a space like this. But what Esther does is she does that. She passes. She is protected. And then what happens? Do you all know the story of Esther? She gets called out. Why? Because her people, the Jewish people, the people that she's kind of ignored this whole time, they're going to be killed off. If you jump back into scripture and look up in the story of Esther, you will find that this edict, the king's edict to destroy all Jews, is written in every language, so all people can understand. Okay? So it's all dialects. So for me, it would be like Saturi, right? It's a dialect of the Korean language. It's unique in the way it's spoken, some of the terminology, right? Think about it. The words of destruction are written in someone's heart language so they can absolutely understand. Hold that thought. Esther is challenged with speaking up for her people, and she needs to figure out who the heck are her people. And so that's my challenge to you as a fellowship that identifies as Asian Americans. Who are your people? This is not to say that you do not love anyone else. This is not to say that you do not care about the rest of the world or the rest of the campus. But you have chosen this fellowship for a reason. And I want to say that maybe you are trying to identify with your people. And I know that sounds really like we're walking a fine line, and what is this lady saying? I think that even though the terminology of Asian American is a political term, I do think that there are some values and that there are cultural norms that many, if not all, of us have grown up with. That maybe we can't identify, but we feel comfortable in a space that takes on some of those rules, right? This group, historically, I cannot tell, this is honest, I cannot tell by your faces what you're thinking. This has always been the case with Asian American audiences. I've spoken all over this country. Every Asian American fellowship, you all have the same expression on your face. This is it. And you just crack a smile. And then what happens afterwards is that I have a group of students who want to talk to me, and they're so thankful, and thank you for saying this, and I've never heard anyone say this before. I've never heard an Asian American woman preach the gospel without fail for the last 20 years. I think there is something about the way we express ourselves that is very different than white America. It's very different than the black church. It is very different, and you know what? It's very good. It's very good. I have told over and over white speakers or non-Asian American speakers who come to speak to an Asian American fellowship, don't worry. They're going to look like they, common term is RBF, right? Think about that. Like if I could show you a mirror of what you look like, that's what it is. But I know that that's not actually in this context. So for Esther, she had to figure out who her people were, and she had to claim Jewish people as her own by actually being Jewish. And that's when I challenge you as Asian American students who for all intents and purposes have been told in one way or another to chase after the American dream, to consider that maybe God has something bigger for you. Something more creative, more inclusive, not just for your families, but for your communities. What would it look like that you live out your faith and you live out the privilege and the opportunities you have to bring about the good news to other generations of Asian Americans? What would that look like? How would Northwestern look differently if they knew you all thought what was happening, what was unjust on campus, was important to Jesus? You are only siloed if you only hang out to talk about Jesus and never live out Jesus on the campus. And so that's what Esther was being asked. Will you step out, risk your life, and identify as Jewish? Because she could have approached the king and told him, I've heard about this very bad thing of genocide, and I think that's a bad idea. But she recognized that actually claiming her Jewishness was part of that brave invitation to stand up against injustice. That because if genocide still happened, she and her people would die. What does it look like to align ourselves as Asian Americans with the injustice that is happening in this world, or maybe even on this campus, to Asian Americans and other students of color? What does it look like to risk being a little uncomfortable, or risking maybe your A or B on that midterm to a C or a B? What does it risk to actually consider that there are systems on this campus that you can align with and bring about justice? I point to heart language because as Asian Americans, we do not share a language. And I tell white audiences all the time, that is what makes Asian Americans unique. We don't have a common language. So when I say heart language, what are the ways in which you all know that your parents love you, but not in the ways we have seen in TV? What are the ways in which you know your parents love you? Raise your hand. How do you know your parents love you?
They cook me food.
They cook you food. And how much food do they cook you?
A lot.
A lot of food. A lot of food. They may simultaneously say, you have gained weight in college. Eat more and more and more. Right? I was so happy. My son, who was a sophomore in college, he gained 25 pounds his freshman year. I was so happy. I was so happy because I was like, why are you so skinny? I feed you a lot of protein. But why? So he went to college, he put on protein powder, working out all this, 25 pounds. I was like, oh, I'm so happy. I'm so, but wow, you are so expensive now that you're home. You want steak and you want seafood, but I will cook it for you. And I will cook it for you 5 times a day if that's what you want. How else do you know that your parents love you? Only food? Is that our only love language? I see some parents here. Parents, how do you make sure your kids know that you love them? I know, turn around. Isn't this fun? I get to put parents on the spot. Parents, how do you tell your kids you love them? I like to text my kids. I like to text my knows that her dad loves her and cares for her because their love language is movies. So she was a dance major and a film major, and so they communicate a lot about this common interest. And I love that because I couldn't do that with my parents. Not only because we didn't have texting or Find My Friends, but because we had a language barrier. Right, so I don't know how many of you have a language barrier. So the idea of a heart language for Esther was that these edicts of destruction were written in the heart language. And so for us as an Asian American fellowship, what is or what are the heart languages that you can speak to other Asian Americans on campus? How can you love others with food? You know what? It's true. Who's going to Urbana? Woo! Okay, so for those of you who have not been to Urbana, you're missing out. For those of you who are going, you will quickly learn that the Asian American Lounge is the lounge known for food, for hospitality, for welcoming and rest. That there's always food. There are staff and students who come from the other lounges because they know they can find hospitality. And I think part of it is that for so many of us, part of our heart language is that we saw our parents be extremely hospitable with so little. The door was always open. Somehow all the aunties and uncles were fed, right? I have the hope in heaven that I will speak both Korean and English. And that distinction is important because I do think that there is something about our identity as Asian Americans that we are both quite proud of and quite uncomfortable with. You need to remember that whiteness is considered normative. Nobody asks why the white kids are always hanging out. Nobody asks why are the white kids always eating together in the cafeteria. No one asks why the Greek system is so white. They ask, why do Asian Americans need an Asian American interest, sorority, and fraternity? They ask, why do the Asian Americans need their own fellowship? We are asked, why do the Asian Americans then need to divide up into Chinese, Korean, Taiwanese? No one asks, why are the white students all together? There's a new book out that I encourage you to pick up, along with mine. And it's called Race on Campus, written by another amazing Korean American woman, Dr. Julie J. Park. And she says there are two institutions within higher education that isolate white students more than anywhere else. It's the Greek system and religious organizations. So within the Greek system and religious organizations, it allows white students to never have to cross ethnic or racial lines. And so white students who are involved in the Greek system or religious organizations are less likely to have close friends of another race. So again, I want to encourage you as Asian American InterVarsity to consider you straddle this really unique space. You are a religious organization, but you are also identifying your ethnic and cultural heritage in a way that you can be a blessing on this campus in a way others cannot. So long as you know why you are called to be this chapter. Asian Americans need to be engaged in social justice because I believe it is part of the gospel. We need to know how to reach our people and then the world. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you for this opportunity to come home again and to know that the work you continue to do in this space is holy and it is uncomfortable. Jesus, sometimes you ask us to stick out, to be the nail that sticks out, and to risk being hammered down. And so I pray that the students gathered here tonight are willing to risk comfort and security, knowing that in you there is much joy. much freedom, and the invitation to be good news for this place and the world beyond. In Jesus' name, amen.